Today I'm making, or I guess rather remaking, a record cabinet that I put together for a client. He was looking specifically for something out of mahogany and something veneered, not solid wood. He was a little bit apprehensive about wood movement and the potential for things to come apart. I was happy to oblige. I made the original cabinet out of mahogany plywood that I picked up from my specialty plywood shop, and it caused me no end of troubles. The veneer was just so thin that it chipped out like crazy, it scratched, it was just very difficult to work with. So that led to this video where I end up remaking the cabinet. This time I'm using birch plywood. 1/2-inch birch plywood laminated together to make the walls and shelves about 1 inch thick. I'm then going to apply veneer myself to this. I picked up 2 types of veneer. They look pretty well identical. I'm using one on the inside and one on the outside. One's paper backed and one's not. Watch along and hopefully you can pick up a tip or two. The first step in the process is what you can see me doing here. I'm just sanding everything flat. I have the panels cut down right to size, sand all of the little glue bumps or any imperfections off, and just get this as smooth as possible. Again, these are the insides of the cabinet. We're going to do them first before we assemble it. It would be an absolute nightmare to try to do this with the cabinet assembled. You don't have to worry about sanding through the birch veneer here. The key is just to make it nice and flat. Once all the sanding's done, just vacuum off all the dust. There are many ways to attach veneer to plywood. You can buy the veneer that has the sticky back, you can use wood glue, you can use veneer glue, you can use epoxy, you can use contact cement. Since I don't have a vacuum bag, I'm going to use the contact cement method. I know I could get around this by just using a bunch of weights and kind of stacking it on top with a piece of plywood or whatever, but I find the contact cement approach to this works very well. It never comes apart. It's fairly easy to apply. There's only a couple of tricks you need to remember, and we'll go through those here today. I cut the veneer pieces to just over the size of the piece that I'm going to be veneering. This gives you a little bit of wiggle room if it gets a little bit squirrely when you're sticking the contact cement together. If you haven't used contact cement before, it works just as the name implies. You apply the cement to both halves, let them dry, and as soon as they make contact, they are permanently stuck together. I like to use the piece of plywood that I'm going to be veneering as a platform. This way you don't risk getting any contact cement onto your work surface, which can then transfer back to the good side. Contact cement can be removed with mineral spirits, but really it is best just to not get any on the show side. So by doing this, you can brush right up to the edge. If your paintbrush or your roller happens to go over a little bit, then it's no big deal. Just be mindful and make sure you try not to get any on the show face. I'm using a couple different brands of contact cement for this project, just whatever they happen to have for sale at the store when I bought it. The important things for me are I don't use the water-based stuff. I've never used it. This really stinky stuff seems to work very good. It's reliable and repeatable. And always wear a respirator. This stuff is super noxious. Yeah, just wear a respirator. Once you have the contact cement applied to the veneer, repeat the process on the plywood. Just give a nice even coat. You got to be careful not to back brush too much on this because it does start to tack up pretty fast. You can end up with little goobers or it kind of peeling apart and sticking to the brush. So just work fast, be smooth, and try not to go over the areas that are already smooth because you're not going to make it any better. You got to give both sides about 50 minutes to dry, maybe a little bit longer depending on your humidity and temperature. For me, it was about 25 minutes for this. I just kind of left and came back and it was tacked up. You can tell when it's ready because you can stick your hand on it or your gloves on it and they don't stick. It's not wet, but it's still a little bit tacky. So then you're good to go to repeat the process. Just apply it to both sides, let it sit for 15 or 20 minutes, and we'll be ready to move on. With the second coat dry, I just quickly go over everything to make sure there's no hairs from the brush, no flies, no little bit of dirt that got stuck in during the process. You got to make sure there's no bumps because they can telegraph through the veneer and then you're hosed. You can't get rid of them. You can't sand them out. They're just there forever. So take a minute, check everything over and make sure there's no bumps. Now, the easiest way to stick 2 surfaces together with contact cement is to use dowels or sticks or something to keep the pieces apart, but allowing you to line them up. What I'm using here is a few offcuts of maple that I have that are about 1 inch thick that allow me to set the veneer on top of the wood and line it up, but not have them touch. Then you just connect one end and you can see that it sticks pretty permanently right away. You pick up the end of the veneer, you remove the rest of the sticks, and you just push and roll the 2 pieces together. Once it's all stuck together, you got to push out all the air bubbles or any bubbles that are left inside. You can buy a J roller for this. I have one, but I don't find it works very well. I watched a video, I think it was Longview Woodworking, Longview Wood Shop. He uses a piece of hardwood, maple or cherry, and rounds over the edges. So that's what I did here. I took a piece of 4/4 cherry, rounded over the edges, and just use it to push along with the grain back and forth from the center to the outside to get any bubbles out. You can see I did get a little bit of contact cement on the show side of this one piece. So I just carefully go back and forth with some mineral spirits and wipe it off. And it comes off okay. Again, you want to try to avoid it, but it's not the end of the world if you do get some on there. After I followed the same process with all of the panels, it was time to trim up the edges. I used my trim router with a 1/8 inch laminate bit or flush trim bit or whatever you have. I use a cheap bit for this and it seems to work pretty good. And the reason why I use a cheap bit is the bearing gets super gummed up with the contact cement and I just don't want to wreck a nice bit. I think the key here is to have a sharp bit and change them frequently, and you don't need to go hog wild with the most expensive bits and bits bit. The two side panels have dados and I wasn't quite sure how this would work because the dados are about a 1/2 inch thick, but the bearing was just thin enough that it worked, so I just followed along the outside rabbets and then the dados in the center for the shelf and trimmed them all out. You do end up with a little bit of a gummy mess on the corners and a pretty sharp edge, so I just take a hand sanding block here with 150 grit paper and just gently go over and soften that edge just a little bit and clean up any of the gummy stuff that the router leaves behind. With the veneer applied to all of the inside pieces, it's time to glue up the cabinet carcass here. I start by squeezing a little bit of glue into the dado and spreading it out with my finger. It's really important here that you don't have any squeeze out. It's still veneer and is very challenging to sand, and you just really want to make sure you keep squeeze out to a minimum, so use the minimal amount of glue here. Assembling the cabinet is pretty straightforward. I start by sliding the shelf into the dados, and then I put the glue down on the base where the sides of the cabinet are going to sit. One nice thing with a veneered cabinet like this is you don't have to worry about mitering the corners, because everything will be hidden underneath the veneer. So I just get everything lined up here, being very careful to make sure that no glue squeezes out onto the veneer. Then I use these Woodpecker knockoff Amazon corner clamps to hold everything secure while I drive some trim head screws through the joints at the top. I used my CNC to cut this oval in the top half of the back panel to allow for the cables for the record player and the amplifier to pass through. The face frame from this cabinet is going to be completely rounded over, and I figured the best way to do that was to round over the edge facing the inside before I installed it on the cabinet. That would allow me to veneer over it and then round over the outside. To start, I round over one edge and then I run it through my table saw using my thin rip jig to get it down to the exact thickness of the 2 sheets of plywood, which is just under 1 inch. Then I carefully glue it onto the face of the cabinet, being sure again not to get any glue on the veneer and making sure to get glue inside the miters. I hold it in place with some of this yellow frog masking tape. It's not as good as the green frog tape, but it was all they had at Home Depot the other day when I went, but it does the job and holds it in place. After letting the glue dry overnight, I went with my block plane and just trimmed up the edge that was a little bit proud on the outside of the cabinet. And then I went over it with a sander just to get it nice and smooth and make sure everything is perfectly flush. Again, you don't have to worry about sanding through the birch veneer here because you're going to be covering it with the veneer. So the trick here is just to get it perfectly smooth. I used some of this wood filler and just caked it on to fill any of the screw holes or any of the little gaps between the face frame and the plywood. And once that was dry, I just sanded it all off. The process for veneering the outside of the cabinet is basically the same as doing the inside. I go through here and I just cut all of the pieces to size, again just slightly oversized so that I have them all ready. If you're wondering where I got this awesome shirt, you can just check out my website in the description. I got lots of merch available, so yeah, shout out to me. You should definitely take a look. Because the veneers will overlap each other in the corners, I think it's important to do the sides first and then the bottom and the top after. The seam is very small, but I feel like it makes it look less pronounced if it's on the side, not on the top. Then I repeat the process I went through for the inside pieces, where I use the sticks to hold the veneer off, gently remove them, and then rub out any air bubbles that come up with this piece of rounded over cherry. Because the veneer pieces are going to overlap, it's important to make sure you use your flush trim bit on your router to clean up the sides to get it perfectly flush before you apply the next side. You see for the top here, I put a little masking tape barricade to just keep any from spilling over the edge while I'm putting the contact cement on the top. And then just repeat the process here again. I did stop to make sure that the bearing was spinning because I didn't want to create any kind of mark here in the veneer when I was trimming up the top. It's important to make sure that you sand down so you don't lift up the veneer here as you're kind of cleaning up the gunk and the edges. I just use the hand sanding block here, and again, just go over everything really gently just to make sure that there's no sharp edges, nothing will lift off, and that any of the gunk from the router is cleaned up. With the veneer all done, it's now time to round over the outside edge. This is definitely a little bit spicy. You can see here I'm using my square just to make sure that the support I've got clamped on is perfectly flush with the top. And then it's really just a game of dodge the clamps with the router. You just got to go slow, take it easy, and make sure you don't tip the router, because if you gouge into that veneer, you're sunk. Just the way the clamps work, there was a couple spots I couldn't get with the routers, so I used the soft interface pad on my 5-inch sander here and just went over everything and really just tried to smooth it out to make sure everything looked nice and the round over was good and even. I cut a 45 on each piece of the face here and lined it up so that it was the right size on the inside. I then went through with a rasp and a file and then tried to mimic the profile as best I could on the side so that it would sit nice and flush up against it. And once again, I glued it on with some Titebond 3 and used some tape to hold it in place. Well, that's about it for how I veneered this cabinet. You can see here I'm just wiping it down with some mineral spirits, and then I'm going to apply a General Finishes oil-based gel stain to it, and then finally cover it with some Rubio Monocoat Pure. All in all, this went very well, much better than using the store-bought plywood with the mahogany veneer. I really don't know that I'll go back to buying plywood like that anymore. It's $250, $260 a sheet, and it's a pain to work with. I guess for big cabinet jobs it makes sense, but for furniture like this, I think I'm just going to stick with applying my own veneer and going from there. It doesn't take much longer. The cost works out to about the same, even including the labor to apply the veneer. So yeah, I think this will be my path forward. I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know in the comments below what you think, if this is the great way to do this, if you would prefer just to buy the veneered plywood. I'd be curious what you all think and how you guys approach challenges like this. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed. Have a great day.